swing low. O chariot, swing low, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, stop. The promise of freedom. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation extended the hope of liberation to millions of enslaved individuals across the southern states. By the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865, that hope had ignited like wildfire among the black population of Mississippi. Families who had endured the weight of bondage for generations dared to believe a new existence was finally beginning. They dreamed of land to call their own, schools where their children could learn, and the dignity that came with laboring for themselves. At Davis Bend, a plantation that once belonged to Joseph Davis, the brother of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, this aspiration seemed almost tangible. Before the war, Joseph had experimented with granting enslaved people a degree of autonomy, and many of those now freed believed this would lay the groundwork for an equitable future. The whispered promise of 40 acres and a mule echoed through the communities, a powerful symbol that true independence might be within grasp. Small churches and humble schools began to spring up near the banks of the Mississippi River, offering both spiritual solace and the light of education. Yet, beneath the surface of excitement, a current of fear lingered. Many white landowners resisted the changing times, steadfast in their determination to maintain control over the cotton fields that fueled the economy. Still, in those early years following the war, hope was a formidable force. For the men and women of Mississippi, freedom felt close enough to hold, and Davis Bend became a guiding light, illustrating what life beyond the shackles of slavery could one day resemble. Reconstruction in Mississippi. Between 1865 and 1877, the Reconstruction era transformed Mississippi into a central battleground where the very definition of freedom was fiercely contested. At Davis Bend, freedmen organized themselves into one of the most remarkable experiments of the age. They elected leaders from within their own ranks, managed the schedules of farming, and even established local councils to settle disputes. Cotton remained the region's dominant crop, but for the first time, those who cultivated it could negotiate how the harvest would be divided. Families worked their own designated parcels, selling a portion of their yield while setting aside food for their own survival. Schools rose from wooden planks salvaged from abandoned buildings, and children who had previously known only the labor of the fields now sat on benches, learning to read and write. Churches evolved into hubs of both resistance and unity, offering not only prayer but also strategies for navigating a hostile environment. Visitors arriving from other states described Davis Bend as a symbol of what was possible, a place where black autonomy flourished on land still scarred by war. Yet challenges mounted swiftly. Nearby white landowners viewed the success of Davis Bend with fear, interpreting it as a direct threat to their own dominance. Violence, intimidation, and legal manipulation began to spread, all aimed at dismantling what the freedmen were painstakingly constructing. Still, for several years, Davis Bend stood as living proof that people once held in bondage could govern themselves, work productively, and prosper without chains. It was a fragile but radiant moment in Mississippi's Reconstruction narrative. The rise of the sharecropping system. By the early 1870s, the bright promise of true freedom began to dim as a new system entrenched itself across Mississippi, sharecropping. At first glance, it appeared to offer opportunity. Freedmen who possessed no land of their own could now sign contracts to farm the properties of their former masters. In return, they would surrender a portion of their harvest, typically cotton, to the landowner at the end of the season. For families who possessed nothing but their labor, this seemed like a reasonable arrangement. At Davis Bend, many believed that through hard work, they could finally achieve independence. Men and women planted endless rows of cotton beneath the blazing southern sun, dreaming that the next harvest would yield enough profit to purchase tools, clothing, or even a small plot of land. But the scales of power were unbalanced from the very start. Landowners drafted the contracts, and most freedmen could not decipher the intricate details. Promises were easily broken, and the terms were deliberately skewed to favor the white owners. A poor season, floods from the Mississippi River, or a sudden drop in cotton prices could obliterate a family's chance to break free. Sharecropping quickly transformed into a snare rather than a pathway forward. Instead of accumulating wealth, freed families became locked in endless cycles of dependency on those who had once held them in bondage. The introduction of false debts. connected to sharecropping came another cruel invention, the plantation store. At Davis Bend and on plantations throughout Mississippi, landowners insisted that freedmen purchase seeds, tools, and food exclusively from their stores. Prices were inflated, and every item was meticulously recorded as a debt against the family's future share of the harvest. A plow that might have cost a few dollars elsewhere was sold for double or triple the price. Bags of seed were weighed light but charged heavy. Families required these supplies merely to survive, so they signed the credit books without any real choice. When harvest time arrived, landowners calculated the debts using numbers that never seemed to align correctly. No matter how much cotton was delivered, the storekeeper would inevitably declare that expenses had exceeded earnings. Families who had toiled from dawn until dusk discovered that, instead of turning a profit, they now owed even more than before. This system of fabricated debts turned freedom into a hollow illusion. The cotton fields of Mississippi no longer featured chains, but they now contained ledgers that bound families just as securely. Children grew up witnessing their parents' labor year after year with nothing to show for it. At Davis Bend, what had begun as a beacon of hope for independence became a harsh lesson in how easily freedom could be stolen, through paper, ink, and lies. The cycle of dependency. Before we continue with our story, if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next real stories about slavery. Let's continue. Every year at Davis Bend, the same ritual repeated itself. Freedmen and their families gathered anxiously to sign new contracts, hoping that this season would be different. But the cycle of dependency had already been woven into the fabric of the system. Landowners and merchants controlled not only the fields, but also the legal language of the agreements. These contracts bound families to the land for another 12 months, regardless of how unfair the conditions might be. If debts remained unpaid at the end of the year, and they almost always did, families were forbidden to leave until the balance was settled. Of course, the balance never truly cleared. The debt books were manipulated, with costs added for tools that broke, interest charged on unpaid seed, or even penalties for alleged laziness. Parents who dreamed of moving to another county or starting fresh in a different town found themselves trapped. If they attempted to leave, sheriffs and deputies, often allied with the landowners, would hunt them down and drag them back under threat of prison. The result was a cruel illusion. The freed people of Davis Bend were technically no longer slaves, yet their lives were shackled by debt contracts that never expired. Children inherited their parents' obligations, beginning work in the fields almost as soon as they could walk. Families passed from one contract to the next, always hoping for freedom, always ending in disappointment. What appeared to be economic opportunity became a life sentence in disguise, a cycle of dependency that echoed slavery in every way but name. The role of white overseers and merchants. Behind the polished counters of plantation stores and the ledgers of local merchants lay the true machinery of economic enslavement. White overseers and merchants held absolute control over the books, and those books determined the fate of every family at Davis Bend. Few freedmen could read or calculate numbers well enough to challenge the figures. Even if they tried, the courts of Mississippi, dominated by white judges and juries, almost always ruled in favor of the merchants. An overseer could simply claim that a family's harvest had been smaller than reported, and there was no means of disputing it. Merchants often weighed cotton on scales that were already rigged, subtracting pounds that had been honestly picked. At the end of the season, a family might deliver hundreds of pounds of cotton only to be informed that their debt had actually increased. Many recognized the fraud, but they had no power to resist. Violence always lurked in the background. Anyone who protested too loudly risked beatings, eviction, or worse. Overseers patrolled the fields, ensuring that work was constant and discipline severe. Merchants, meanwhile, extended credit deliberately, making certain that no family could ever fully pay off what they owed. This manipulation of records was intentional, a calculated strategy to preserve control. The paper contracts, the store accounts, and the false weights all worked together to create a prison without visible walls. Davis Bend became a place where hope was systematically drained, where families were bound not by iron chains, but by numbers written in ink that could never be erased. The broken promises of land ownership. When the Civil War ended, the phrase, 40 acres and a mule, spread across the South like a sacred vow. For the freed people of Mississippi, land signified everything: independence, stability, and the opportunity to provide for future generations. At Davis Bend, many families believed this promise would finally grant them the soil they had worked for decades without compensation. They imagined planting not only cotton for sale, but also corn, beans, and vegetables to nourish their children. Owning land meant no more begging merchants for credit or living at the mercy of a plantation store. Yet the promise never materialized. Instead of land being distributed to freed families, much of it was returned to the very men who had supported the Confederacy. Wealthy white landowners reclaimed the plantations, including areas near Davis Bend, and quickly pushed freedmen back into labor contracts. The few who attempted to buy land faced impossibly high prices or were cheated through false deeds and corrupt officials. Mules, tools, and seed were withheld unless debts were signed, ensuring that no family could plant without owing more than they earned. The dream of land ownership, so vivid in the years immediately after emancipation, became yet another cruel illusion. At Davis Bend, hope curdled into despair as families realized they would never be permitted to own the fields they had plowed for generations. Instead of building independent farms, they were forced back into a system where the very soil became a weapon against them. The legal system in Mississippi that sided with landowners. For the freed people of Mississippi in the 1870s, the courtroom was no place of justice. The legal system was controlled by white lawmakers, judges, and sheriffs who worked hand in hand with landowners and merchants. At Davis Bend, when families dared to challenge unfair contracts or fabricated debts, they found doors closed before the trial could even begin. A freedman might present witnesses or proof that he had delivered more cotton than was recorded, but the judge would dismiss his testimony as worthless. The word of a black man carried little weight against that of a white merchant. Court clerks delayed hearings, imposed heavy fees, or simply ignored petitions altogether. Sheriffs enforced eviction orders without hesitation, dragging families from their cabins if they dared to resist plantation authority. Debt peonage was reinforced not only by the plantation store, but by the laws themselves. Mississippi statutes allowed landowners to seize harvests, livestock, or tools to satisfy debts that were often fabricated in the first place. Those who attempted to flee the system were hunted down as contract jumpers and sometimes jailed until they could be forced back into the fields. The legal system became a shield for those who profited from exploitation and a weapon against those who sought freedom. At Davis Bend, people learned quickly that signing a contract meant surrendering not only their labor, but also their voice in the eyes of the law. The courtroom, rather than protecting the rights of the newly freed, became another stage where the old power of slavery was dressed in the new clothing of legality. The generational impact. By the year 1873, the tragedy of Davis Bend was no longer confined to the men and women who had once been enslaved. It had begun to shape the very lives of their children. From the moment they could carry a water bucket or pick cotton from the stalk, children were drawn into the cycle of labor. Parents often hoped that education would be their escape. But schools in Mississippi were underfunded, targeted by hostile neighbors, or destroyed by white supremacist groups who viewed literacy as a threat. At Davis Bend, children learned early that their future was already written in the debt ledgers of the plantation stores. When parents died or grew too weak to work, their children inherited the unpaid balance, binding them to the same land. Even marriage could not break the cycle. Young couples often discovered that both families carried debts, which then merged into a single, larger obligation. Dreams of moving away, finding work in nearby towns like Vicksburg or Natchez, were crushed by sheriffs who tracked down debtors and returned them to the fields. Generations were chained to the same cotton rows year after year, under contracts designed to last forever. For the children of Davis Bend, freedom was something spoken about in church sermons and whispered at night, but never truly lived. The weight of false debts passed from father to son, from mother to daughter, until it became not merely an economic system, but a way of life. The plantation economy had discovered a method to turn freedom itself into an inheritance, and it was an inheritance of bondage. The slow collapse of Davis Bend's vision. Davis Bend had once been imagined as a beacon of progress. Freed families believed it could demonstrate to the nation that black communities were capable of self-rule, prosperity, and independence. For a brief moment, it worked. Schools were built, churches were filled, and families organized their own councils. But by the mid-1870s, the weight of debt, the manipulation of merchants, and the hostility of white neighbors crushed this vision. The false debts became unbearable, draining any chance of profit from the cotton harvests. Many families fled, some moving north along the Mississippi River in search of better opportunities, while others disappeared into nearby towns as wage laborers. But even those who escaped carried the scars of betrayal. The land itself, once a symbol of hope, returned to the control of white landowners who restored the old plantation order under new names. By the late Reconstruction years, Davis Bend had lost its dream of freedom. What remained was a cautionary tale about promises broken and opportunities stolen. For the freedmen who had placed their trust in contracts, schools, and churches, the collapse was not merely material, but deeply spiritual. They had fought to prove that freedom could thrive. But the system of eternal false debts ensured that slavery survived in another form. The legacy of Davis Bend lived on as a story told by elders to their grandchildren, a story of hope that was strangled, and a freedom that was promised but never delivered. It stood as proof that the end of slavery in law did not mean the end of slavery in practice.